someone is going to help me with this one.
We first take the opportunity to say how glad I am to be here, and that this conference room brings back lots of memories. Maybe 25 years ago, when this government was in opposition, we had a brainstorming session. It was supposed to be a seminar or a symposium on the future of Jamaica development. And like it was Groundhog Day listening this morning, same things we worried about then, the same things we hear about now. Except we've missed quite a few opportunities in the process, and I hope we don't pay too big a price. I want to talk a little bit about climate change, energy, and mechanisms that were developed. And I start with the organization with the funny name, the sit-down. Why is this funny name, and where did it come from? One very cold night in Poznan, Poland, in Conference of the Parties, I think it was the 14th session. It was midnight. It was the day before the end of the negotiations. We're discussing climate change adaptation. And as you know, Jamaica and the small islands, we negotiate as part of something called the Group of 77 in China. Well, there is a piece in the negotiations that we seek funding for adaptation, and it's called response measures. And one major oil-producing country insisted that we had to put text in this document that whatever money the kingdom lost by not selling oil would be compensated from the adaptation fund. Well, as science advisor, I basically said I couldn't agree. So we gathered together our colleagues from the SIDS, and we drew a line in the sand that there would be no position on adaptation from the G77. But that left us in a very vulnerable position because, as we know, adaptation is a very costly thing. And if you just look at the kind of destruction from just the hydrometeorological events and the sea level rise, we know it's going to be even greater. Just to give you a small tidbit, maybe 2 years ago, the UNDP office in Barbados did one assessment for the Caribbean as to what are the likely costs of sea level rise, just 1 meter of sea level rise. And just for the CARICOM countries, not Haiti, not Cuba, not Libya, just for the CARICOM countries. And that 1 meter was going to cost us $100 billion in infrastructure damage. This is ports, bridges, airports, beaches, $100 billion. Now, if you look at that, you look what is the GDP of our economies, you figure that that is a significant amount. So the idea was, how will we finance adaptation if we choose not to go with the position of G77 partners? And with that, the idea of transforming the energy sector to minimize the outflow of foreign currency that would make that money available for investment in adaptation to climate change was born. Briefly, we spend, as a collective group of small island states, we import maybe 220 million barrels of petroleum products per year. We have the highest energy costs of any group of countries. I heard the minister say 44 cents, but there are other islands where it's $1, $1.25 per kilowatt hour, where the fuel comes in drums, not in tankers. So we have a really serious energy problem. So the idea was, if we can transform the energy sector, then we would generate our own resources to deal with the impacts of climate change adaptation. And though many of you here, except my good colleague Dr. Taylor sitting in the back there, may not spend much time worrying about climate change, it is something that you ought to be very worried about. So whatever the urgency that the minister gave you this morning for transforming the energy sector, I can tell you the urgency is orders of magnitude greater if you don't transform the energy sector. Because it's the only place that there will be funds can be generated to invest in adaptation. And we won't get the adaptation money from the developed countries' economies. We all know the state of the world economy. There's a lot of rich people, but not many rich countries anymore. So we have to paddle this canoe for ourselves. And so the SITSDOC was named. It was intended to be a mechanism to which small island states could participate in, could bring their projects, could bring their technical needs, could bring their information needs, and we work collectively. So it's a docking station. It's like how you put your computer into a docking station and you get all the information. And that's what the SITSDOC is. So briefly, the concept came from the two regional organizations that are responsible for climate change. The one with Plenty, the Caribbean Climate Change Center, and SPREC, which is the South Pacific Secretariat for the Environment. It's briefly intended to allow us to do a couple of things. Let me just skip down. I won't get to you see the upper limits. We all know, I don't know how many of you know the science, but and I don't really want to scare you, but we, to survive as a group of countries, we had to keep the average temperature increase to less than 1.5 degrees, which coincided to about 350 parts per million of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. We're already at about 390, 387 4 years ago, and figure that we are closer now to 400. So we're not just talking about stopping emission of carbon. We're talking about actually having to remove carbon from the atmosphere so that the ecosystems basically have a chance to survive. And we can talk during the panel discussions of what are some of those consequences if we don't keep the temperature under 1.5. And the latest data we have is already the Caribbean Sea is 1 degree warmer. So we don't have a lot of leeway, and the emissions are continuing to increase. Just slide down, next slide. A little bit of this I mentioned before about the high cost of electricity, the high dependence on fossil fuel. What guided our decision was one big case study from Denmark, who actually turned out to be our first supporter. Denmark had taken a strategy over some 20 years to go to a very low carbon development. They invested significantly in efficiency, something I think we too frequently disregard. After all, if you look at the economics of efficiency, you find payback times from 6 months to 3 years. Yeah? Now, on supply side, you don't have any supply side that can pay back in that short period of time. But consistently, we overemphasize supply side and we de-emphasize conservation and efficiency. It's bad expenditures. It's really not sensible, particularly if you live in a climate of limited financial investments. Efficiency should be our #1 priority as developing countries. I compare it basically, if you have a water tank on your roof and the pipes are leaking, it doesn't make sense to put a bigger tank on the roof till you fix the bloody leaks in the pipes. It's just simple common sense. Yet, we continue, it's sexy, it's easy to say we want big projects rather than big efficiency. We in the Caribbean are absolutely terrible. We take about 4 times the amount of energy to make a unit of GDP as does Japan and Singapore. And if you look at the nature of those economies compared to us, we're really missing big opportunities. So we found out from the Scandinavians that they had grown over about 2 decades their GDP by 70% without increasing greenhouse gas emissions. That was basically the kind of information that we wanted to support what we were about to do. Because, you know, ministers always ask you, well, where has it been done before? So, guess where we got. In the little bit about our financial background where we are as small island states, which made us even more jittery. I heard the minister talk, and a couple colleagues talk about the high GDP to debt ratios. Well, let me just show you a little bit. Jamaica is not alone. This is what we look like in the SIDS. If we could go down, yes. This is what we look like as small island states. Big GDP debt ratios. Lots of us hear a lot about Greece and Spain, yeah, and the financial meltdown. They don't look like this. I'm wondering if we were European countries, if they would have declared that we were already disastrous. Yeah? But this is the reality. You can't service your debt, you can't invest, you can't grow your economies. So we have to find ways to actually, we can't borrow to deal with climate change adaptation. So, because one is, we really don't know what kind of economy we'll have in the future. I'll give you one example. There is one beach in Grenada called Grandas. This beach is the hub of the tourism industry in Grenada. It will go as soon as sea level reaches about 1 meter, this beach will disappear unless you make significant investments. Now, to invest in like your beach protection, if we use the tetrapod system, it's like $4,000 per meter. So you think about how much you'd have to invest to protect an airport, how much you'd have to invest to rebuild your ports, how much you have to invest to replace your roads. So as you look down and you look at what you have to pay from the consequences of climate change, and you look at what your economy is, you look at the nature of the economy, you reach the obvious conclusion that we are in serious problems. No other set of countries have faced these kinds of challenges to their future survival. So for us, monitoring climate change is one thing, but adapting the climate change, adapting the energy sector to generate the resources we need to deal with climate change is absolutely essential. Can I go next slide? So here are the 4 reasons why we decided to have the SIDS done. 1 is to assist the transition to a sustainable energy sector. 2, providing a global mechanism that will mobilize resources. Allow us to basically participate in the global carbon market. We as a group of countries emit about 35 million tons of carbon per year, but we don't do any trading. In the majority of cases, some of the projects are too small, the transaction costs are too high, but through SIDS, we can basically aggregate, we can trade, and then we can return those funds back to the country to invest in more sustainable energy. And most of all, to basically allow us a mechanism that we can get resources from the Climate Adaptation Fund as a collective group. Now, one of the big challenges we face is our policy, and I'm glad to see that a number of my colleagues will be talking about policy, because it's very hard to invest when you go into countries and the policy environment is very different. And across the SIDS, we have very different policy environment. So one of the big challenges is trying to figure how do we get across these collections of small island states a harmonized policy environment, so when an investor goes in, he's basically not confronted with different types of animals every time he gets off the plane. So this is kind of critical to what we want to do. Second, is we want to move to the global market, and I will skip a few slides if we could. Well, but maybe I should just spend a few minutes and talk about the targets, because that's how we get to the amount of funding that we're going to need. We set a target which sounds a lot like Jamaica's target, which was to increase energy efficiency across the board, measured in terms of units of GDP by about 25%. We set another target, which is to have at least 50% of the power come from green sources. And here we have a little different interpretation of green sources, because not only do we talk about PVs and wind and biomass and ocean, but also greening the fuel. We have thousands of megawatts of thermal plants that are in operation in the SIDS, and they have to be financed, they have to be repaid. So we think there's big opportunities for collective work in doing biofuels to green it. And we have done some research with a couple of high photosynthetic plants, energy cane, arundo donuts, different kinds of palms, some of which you will see have returns like 1 unit of energy in, give you 12 or 14 units of energy out. That's like a very good oil, except it's green and it's sustainable. So 50% green. And then we're looking at 25% for fuel substitution. This is to affect both power generation and in the transport sector. Looking at diesel replacement, we don't do a lot of work on ethanol. We think ethanol is not